Hello, government students. In our last lesson, we talked about the process by which the United States Constitution was ratified by the original 13 states. And you may recall that one of the conditions of ratification among many of the states was that the Constitution include a Bill of Rights. The Constitution, as it was originally written, talked a lot about the powers of the government, but it didn't talk about the rights of the individual. And that was a serious omission in the view of many of the people, especially the anti-federalists back during the ratification process. So a Bill of Rights was added to our Constitution, and we still have that Bill of Rights, of course, today. It's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. I like this picture here because it's illustrating one of the, or perhaps two of the rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights. These young men and women, mostly young men and women, are protesting in front of the White House. This picture was taken shortly after the Sandy Hook school shooting back some time ago, a few years ago. And they're saying that, you know, they're protesting and advocating for stricter gun regulations so that there will be less chance of people getting shot up in their schools. So they're actually exercising their right to petition, their right to assemble, and their right to free speech right there in front of the White House. There are many countries in the world where this kind of activity would certainly get you arrested and thrown in jail. So fortunately, that's not the case in our country. Whether or not you agree with their protest or not, let's all agree that they have the right to make their voice heard. So let's continue on then. Here's the original Bill of Rights as it was written and published initially. James Madison is the primary author of the Bill of Rights. He was using the rights that were embedded in the Virginia Constitution as a model for the United States Bill of Rights. And let's go ahead and take a look at the details that are covered in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment of the Constitution is the first one of the Bills of Rights, and it covers what we call the five freedoms: the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. Petition meaning the right to petition the government, to advocate for a cause directly to the government. Freedom of assembly, the right to gather in a group to make your voices heard. The freedom of the press, of course, the press has a right to print the news and to express opinions about the news. Freedom of speech, same kind of deal. You have a right to spoken language, to whatever you want to say. And then freedom of religion. You have a right to practice whatever religion you wish to practice, and your tax dollars should not be used to promote or support a specific religion. You have a freedom, in other words, to not be involved in religion should you so choose. I like this particular picture because it sort of illustrates the idea of freedom of religion, whereas I believe these are probably Muslim women and they have a right to practice their religion however they see fit. Next up is the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And I have quoted here the entire Second Amendment. You don't have to write that down in your notes. Just know that it is dealing with the right to bear arms. But the reason I've got this quoted here is that the Second Amendment, short as it is also quite complex, and also its wording is quite controversial. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What does that mean? Basically, what it comes down to, and here's where there's controversy, is the right to bear arms an individual right that we all had by virtue of being in America? Or is it a collective right? That is it a right that only exists by virtue of being in a well-regulated militia? If it's an individual right, then why did the framers of the Constitution include this phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state? Your right to bear arms shall not be infringed. So that's the whole crux of the issue. It was an issue years and years and years ago. It's an issue today. Do we have an individual right to bear arms? Or is the freedom to bear arms strictly contingent on your membership in the state militia? That's the question, and it's been interpreted by the courts in various ways. Today, the Supreme Court has interpreted this to be an individual right. However, that wasn't always the case. In the past, the Supreme Court interpreted this to mean that there is a collective right contingent on membership in the militia. That interpretation has changed within the last 15 years or so. So it's still a subject that is open to some different interpretations. Right now, the dominant interpretation, at least at the Supreme Court of the United States, is that the right to bear arms is an individual right. You have that right regardless of whether or not you are in a militia. Next up is the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment really isn't applicable so much today. I would call it an anachronism. An anachronism is something that is no longer really relevant. But back in the 1760s and 1770s and 1780s, it was very relevant. In the 1760s, as trouble started brewing in the American colonies, and there became this tendency towards rebellion against some of the strict laws of the British. The British sent lots of troops into America to sort of keep the protests down and to shut the Americans up. And the British did not have places to put all of their troops, so they actually would force people to open up their homes to provide food and shelter to these troops, which the people of America felt were hostile to them. It was a very, very rough time for the American colonists, having to put up with this invasion, the way they would have looked at it, as an invasion of hostile forces right into their homes. You may recall that in the Petition of Right, one of those English documents that influenced our American government, one of the items in the Petition of Right was that there would not be the quartering of troops in people's homes during peacetime. That was true in England, but it was not necessarily true in America. We wanted to make sure in America that we had that right to be free from the presence of troops forcing themselves into your private home. Next up is the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is very relevant still today. It is not an anachronism, and that's freedom from search and seizure without a warrant. You may recall a warrant is permission from a judge to look through your stuff, to enter your home, or even to arrest you. The police are not allowed to be looking in your trunk of your car without a warrant, okay, permission from a judge. So there has to be some reason given to the judge that would warrant, pardon the pun, that would warrant these police to look into your stuff. Next up is the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is probably the longest of the amendments that are embedded in the Bill of Rights. It has several different clauses in there, but basically, if I were to summarize it, it provides you freedom from double jeopardy. In other words, you cannot be tried for the same crime more than once. If you're found innocent or not guilty of a crime, you cannot be tried again for that same crime once you've been found not guilty. It provides you freedom from self-incrimination. That means that you have a right not to speak to the police if you don't want to. You have a right not to be called up to speak in your trial if you want to. You can remain silent. And of course, today, if you are ever arrested, you will be read your rights by the police. And one of those rights, of course, is the right to remain silent. That's dealing with your freedom from self-incrimination. And then the right to due process basically means that you have a right to a court hearing and to have all of your rights that are embedded within the Fifth Amendment honored. Okay, the Sixth Amendment is the right to a speedy jury trial in criminal cases. Speedy, that's an interesting term because there are instances when people are arrested and they don't have their trial for maybe up to a year, maybe even longer. Well, that doesn't sound speedy to me. But what you have to realize is that if there is a long delay like that before your case goes to a trial, that's usually because you yourself as the defendant has requested that time to go ahead and prepare your defense. So assuming then, though, that you've had enough time that you can prepare your defense, you have a right to get your case heard quickly. But again, you have a right to kind of slow the process to allow you to prepare a defense. The Seventh Amendment is quite similar to the Sixth, except for this is your right to a trial by jury in civil cases. Criminal cases, of course, in the Sixth Amendment means that a law has been broken. In civil cases, no law was broken, but perhaps you feel you have been harmed by the actions or the negligence of someone else. And this picture I have here represents a very famous civil case from about 15 or 20 years ago, when there was a woman, I may have mentioned this before in class, a woman bought some coffee at the drive-thru at McDonald's, and she spilt the coffee in her lap, and the hot coffee seeped through her clothing, both her outer clothing as well as her underwear, and caused third-degree burns and $50,000 hospital bill. Well, there was a lawsuit in that case. She had every right to sue McDonald's for damages, which she did, and ended up McDonald's had to pay some significant damages because they were held to be at fault for having coffee that was too hot really to serve, and that could cause that kind of harm, a third-degree burning through 2 layers of clothing. The Eighth Amendment gives you protection from cruel and unusual punishment. This again goes back to the English Bill of Rights, which also provided this protection. In other words, we're talking about torture. You have a right to not have to fear that you're going to be tortured if you were ever picked up by the police. This is a rather harrowing picture I have here. This picture is of a person who has electrodes hooked up to his hands and to his neck. He's got a hood over his face so he can't see what's going on, and he's having to stand on that box. In this particular instance, this is a real event. This person was forced to stand on that box for hours and hours and hours, I believe at least 8 hours. And he was told that should he get off that box, he would be administered electric shocks. That, to most people, is torture, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. Interestingly, this person was confined by Americans, but in Iraq. And it was argued by some that his Eighth Amendment rights did not apply since he was a combatant in Iraq who had been picked up by the American military, and it was believed that he had information about the enemy that we were fighting in Iraq. But this case became publicized. Someone took this picture, and it caused quite an outcry in the United States because it was well known nothing like this would have ever been allowed to happen within the borders of the United States. The argument was that, well, we're not within the borders of the United States. This is a war zone. We can do what we have to do. But it became actually the United States Army decided that this was actually against the military code of conduct, and those who perpetrated this act were punished. And even in a war zone, we are not allowed to be doing this kind of torture to enemies. We have certain protocols that we need to honor when we pick up a prisoner of war, and torture is not allowed. The Ninth Amendment isn't really specific. It just says basically that even though a right may not be specifically mentioned in the Constitution, it does not mean that you don't have that right, that rights are retained by the people, even those rights that aren't specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And I have the exact wording right there for you. Most people interpret the Ninth Amendment to be that you have a right to privacy, that the government, for example, has no business peering into your bedroom and regulating what your behavior is within the confines of your own property. So that's kind of what the cartoon's getting at here, and this is the kind of thing that has been used to suggest that states do not have the right to criminalize, for example, homosexual activities. So that's the Ninth Amendment, basically a right to privacy in most cases. That's what we're talking about. And the last amendment of the Bill of Rights is the 10th Amendment, which basically says that anything that's not covered in the United States Constitution can be covered in the constitutions of the individual states, as long as it is not prohibited by the United States Constitution. So an example of states' rights would be traffic laws. The U.S. Constitution doesn't have anything to say about traffic laws, so that's left up to the states. Some states can have an 80-mile-an-hour speed limit. Other states will have a 65-mile-an-hour speed limit. It's simply up to the states. So again, here is the Bill of Rights as it was originally written, but there's one odd thing about this. There are 10 amendments in our Bill of Rights, but look what I see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There were actually 12 amendments that were originally proposed in the Bill of Rights, but only 10 of them were approved by the states. Your job today is going to be to look at one of those amendments that was not approved by the states. Check Canvas for it, and with that, we are done for the day.